All right, welcome back, everyone. Ready for another deep dive. You guys sent in some really interesting stuff, and today we're going to tackle a research article about, well, how we learn to read and write Chinese. It's kind of like a crash course on what makes Chinese literacy so, well, unique.
Yeah, I mean, that's really it. This deep dive is all about figuring out how learning to read and write in Chinese is different from learning, say, English or Spanish or any language with an alphabet.
Yeah.
And the article we've got here, it points to four big areas where Chinese really stands apart.
And those four areas are the things we'll really be focusing on. First, there's this whole thing with semantic radicals, these little pieces of a character that carry meters. Then we've got this crucial skill called morphological awareness, which is all about understanding how characters combine to form words. And then, of course, we have to talk about the fact that there are actually two main versions of written Chinese out there, simplified and traditional. And finally, we'll get into some really intriguing possibilities about how learning Chinese might actually change the way our brains work. So our mission here is to get to the bottom of why Chinese literacy is so special and what it can teach us about the whole process of learning to read, regardless of the language. Okay, so let's jump right in with something that you just don't find in alphabetic systems, semantic radicals.
Right, radicals are like the basic building blocks you use to create Chinese characters. They're made up of strokes. You have, let's see, about 800 phonetic radicals, and those can sometimes give you a clue about how a character is pronounced, but that's not always reliable. The really interesting part is the semantic radicals. There's about 200 of them. These little guys directly contribute to the meaning of a character, which is something you just don't see happening with letters in an alphabet. It's like the characters have this built-in hint about their meaning.
So let's talk about how they actually work. How do these semantic radicals function in a character? Can you give us a few examples to illustrate this?
Well, think of it like this. A semantic radical, it's kind of like a category label that's embedded within a character. So, for example, you have the radical that represents sun. And guess what? That radical is part of the character for sunny. Pretty straightforward, right? Another example, the eye radical shows up in characters related to vision, like gaze. And then you have the mouth radical, which is found in the character for kiss. The semantic connection is pretty clear, but sometimes it's not quite so obvious what we call opaque examples. For example, the radical for vehicle that's found in the character for soft. Now, that connection might not make sense right away, but historically, it actually did. So, unlike learning the sounds of letters, which mainly helps you pronounce words, learning Chinese involves cracking this visual meaning code that's hidden inside each character.
That's a really cool way to put it, a visual meaning code. And the research you sent over gets really fascinating here. It seems that understanding these radicals, it's not just some random step in learning Chinese characters. It's like this distinct stage, particularly around second grade, a milestone for kids as they learn to read.
Absolutely. There's this study that uses a statistical method called structural equation modeling. It helps researchers see how different skills relate to each other. And what they found was that knowledge of radicals actually emerged as a separate skill from things like, phonological awareness, which is understanding sounds, or morphological awareness, which is about how words are put together, and even from other visual skills. But here's the kicker. This only happened in second grade, so it really does suggest that radical knowledge is its own special type of knowledge that develops at a particular point in a child's journey of learning to read.
Now, the research also mentions a bit of a debate going on. Is it more accurate to think of semantic radicals as morphological knowledge, meaning knowledge about units that carry meaning? Or should we view them as just part of the visual structure of characters, the orthography? What's at the heart of this disagreement?
Well, the main issue is how we usually define morphology. In languages like English, morphology typically refers to how these meaningful units in spoken language, things like prefixes, suffixes, and root words, how they all come together. And these units, they often have their own distinct pronunciations. Now, semantic radicals in Chinese, they definitely carry meaning, but they don't have a separate spoken form within the character. So some researchers say that because they're such an integral part of the character's visual makeup, they're essentially an orthographic feature. But then you have others who argue that their role in conveying meaning, even without a separate pronunciation, means they represent a type of morphological awareness, but at the character level. The article makes a great point that our understanding of morphology has been heavily influenced by studying languages that don't have this unique radical system, so it's a good question.
No, it sounds like regardless of how we classify them, understanding semantic radicals gives learners a real advantage when they're learning Chinese.
Oh, absolutely. When learners realize that certain characters share this common meaning component, the semantic radical. They start to see patterns and group characters together. And this makes a huge difference because it reduces the amount of pure memorization they need to do when they're faced with literally thousands of characters. It's like this built-in organizational system. And what's really fascinating is that research shows even young kids, they kind of intuitively understand how radicals work. They can tell if a character looks right based on its radical structure. And get this, they can even make some pretty good guesses about the meaning or sound of a character they've never seen before just by looking at its radicals.
Wow, that's amazing. It's like they're picking up on these subtle visual cues that relate to meaning, and they're doing it almost instinctively. Okay, let's shift gears a little bit. We've talked about the meaning embedded within single characters. Now let's look at how meaning is created when characters are combined to form words, this whole idea of morphological awareness.
Right, so the article highlights that when you're reading Chinese, you're often dealing with words that are made up of two or more characters. And get this, reading those words, it might actually rely more on understanding how those characters, which often function as individual units of meaning or morphemes, how they combine, rather than just recognizing each character on its own. This is partly because the sound of a single character isn't always a good guide to how the word it's part of is pronounced or what it means. So mastering how those characters come together to build words, with a focus on these units of meaning, that's a much more critical early step in learning Chinese than the approach you take with an alphabet, where you sound out each letter.
And that's what they call lexical compounding, right?
Yeah.
Can you walk us through a few specific examples to show us how this works in practice?
Imagine you have a bunch of Lego bricks. Each brick represents a character with its own meaning. And you can put these bricks together in different ways to build new, bigger structures, words, whose meaning relates to the individual bricks. The article gives a great example of this. Take the character yi, sui, which means study or learn. Now, you see that same character in the word a, suisheng, meaning student, which literally translates to study life. And it's also in the word yi, suixiao, meaning school or study place. It's the same idea with dian, which means electricity. It shows up in the word ea, which is electric brain, meaning computer, and in the word dianhua, which is electric speech, meaning telephone. This pattern of reusing characters to build meaning, you see it all over the place in Chinese.
Right, so it's like recognizing familiar building blocks within these new words. And you also mentioned that there are a lot of homophones in Chinese words that sound the same, and homographs words that are written the same way but have different meanings. That must make this lexical compounding even more important, right?
Exactly. Because you have so many characters that sound alike but have different meanings, or that look similar but are pronounced differently, the context provided by the other characters in a multi-character word becomes crucial for figuring out what the word actually means. Lexical compounding really helps here because when you combine these meaning-carrying units, you often end up with a word that's more specific and less likely to be misunderstood.
And the research really backs up the idea that this skill, understanding how words are formed, is super important for reading Chinese well, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely. Lots of studies have shown this clear link between a child's ability to understand and use lexical compounding and how well they can read Chinese words. And what's even more compelling, research has actually shown that training kids in this area, it can really improve their reading skills. The idea is that when kids come across a new multi-character word, if they recognize some of the characters, the morphemes, and they know what those individual characters mean from spoken Chinese, they can often figure out the meaning of the whole word.
So it sounds like the emphasis at the beginning, when learning to read Chinese, is less about sounding out individual characters and more about understanding how meaning is constructed at the word level. That's a pretty big difference compared to learning an alphabetic language, where you start by decoding letters into sounds.
It's a huge difference. Because the sounds linked to individual Chinese characters aren't always reliable for pronunciation or meaning within a word, learners have to focus more on these meaning-bearing pieces. While phonological awareness, being able to hear and play around with sounds, does play a role in learning Chinese, it's not the main driver early on, not like it is for alphabetic languages. One study even showed that training kindergartners in morphological awareness, specifically focusing on lexical compounding, was actually more effective at boosting their reading skills than training them in phonological awareness. You wouldn't typically see that kind of result in a language like English.
It really goes to show how closely intertwined the syllable, the morpheme, and often the character itself are in Chinese, and how understanding these connections is at the heart of becoming literate in the language.
Exactly right. Lexical compounding really taps into both the meaning, the morphological aspect and the sound, the phonological aspect at the syllable level that are attached to these characters when they come together to form words.
Okay, let's move on to something else that's pretty unique about Chinese. The fact that there are two major scripts in use today, simplified and traditional. This must make things even more complex for people learning the language.
It definitely adds a layer of complexity. So simplified characters are the standard in mainland China and also in Singapore, while traditional characters are still the norm in Hong Kong and Taiwan. And what's interesting is that about half of the most common Chinese characters, they actually look significantly different depending on whether you're looking at the simplified or traditional version.
And I've heard there's a long-running debate about which script is actually easier to learn. What's the consensus there?
Yeah, there's this common argument that traditional characters, because they have a more complex visual structure and more strokes, might be easier to recognize and read because there are more visual distinctions between characters. But on the flip side, they're often considered tougher to write because you have to memorize and produce all those extra strokes. Simplified characters with fewer strokes, well, people assume they're easier to write, but maybe harder to read because they're less visually complex and might look more similar to each other. But, the article makes a good point. The evidence from research isn't conclusive yet. It's hard to isolate the effects of the script itself from other factors like how it's taught or the learning environment.
It makes sense though, right? Writing more strokes, it's got to be more challenging. But the article even mentions that teachers in Hong Kong sometimes encourage their students to use simplified characters during exams just so they can write faster.
Exactly. When you're under pressure and you're trying to write quickly, having to produce all those extra strokes for each character in traditional script, it can be a real hurdle. The fact that there are these two major visual representations of the same language, both widely used, it's pretty unique. Some other languages might have multiple scripts, but it's usually not the case. You have two systems existing side by side, both used for the same set of words, like you do with simplified and traditional Chinese.
So, what does the research tell us about how learning these different scripts might affect how people read? Have there been any interesting findings?
There have been some really intriguing studies. For example, one study found that children in mainland China who learned simplified script, they tended to make more mistakes when they were trying to visually recognize characters compared to children in Taiwan who learned traditional script. And the researchers, they suggested that the reduced visual information in simplified characters might actually force readers to pay even closer attention to those subtle visual details to tell the characters apart. Another study, which followed kids over time, found that kindergartners learning simplified script actually showed better development of basic visual skills early on in their literacy journey compared to kids learning traditional characters. And then there was this really cool brain imaging study that used EEG, and it indicated that readers of simplified script might have a slightly harder time with the initial visual processing of things that weren't even real characters. Again, it hints at a heightened level of visual attention. It seems like the choice of script might actually influence which specific visual processing skills you develop. Simplified characters might hone visual discrimination, while traditional characters might strengthen visual recognition.
That's fascinating. The article also mentions how parents in different regions approach teaching their kids to write, doesn't it?
Yes, one study compared how parents teach writing and found that mothers in Hong Kong, where they use traditional script, were more likely to emphasize visualizing the character and breaking it down into its parts when teaching their kids how to write. Mothers in mainland China, on the other hand, where simplified script is the standard, they tended to focus more on having their kids repeat the whole character over and over again. This might be because traditional characters, with their more elaborate structure, offer more distinct visual patterns to focus on when kids are learning to write them.
So it's a really complex picture, and it shows that the number of strokes isn't the only thing that determines how difficult a script is to learn. How familiar you are with the underlying radicals, whether you're using simplified or traditional characters, that must also play a big role, right?
Totally. If you have a good grasp of those common radicals, you might actually find it easier to learn to write a complex traditional character than a simplified character that uses radicals you're not as familiar with.
Yeah.
This is definitely an area where more research is needed to really understand those subtle differences in how our brains process and learn the two scripts.
Okay, let's move on to one last big question. Could learning Chinese actually have cognitive benefits that go beyond just reading and writing? Does grappling with this unique writing system, does it change the way we perceive or think in some fundamental way?
That's a really interesting question. The article talks about this idea that because Chinese is so visually complex, with thousands of unique characters and these intricate stroke patterns, it probably helps to develop strong memorization skills. In fact, the researcher Nag specifically suggests that. And the way parents often teach Chinese, by focusing on copying very carefully, paying attention to visual details, and understanding the meaning of the components from the very start rather than just the sounds, it suggests a different kind of cognitive engagement compared to learning a language that uses an alphabet.
So what are some of the specific cognitive advantages that the research has identified?
Well, the article highlights two main areas: enhanced phonological sensitivity and strong visual spatial skills. Now, the phonological part might seem surprising because Chinese characters aren't directly based on sounds, right? However, most Chinese learners use either pinyin or zhuin fuhao, which are systems that use Roman letters or special symbols to represent the sounds and tones of Mandarin. Research has shown that working with these systems can actually improve a learner's ability to hear and manipulate sounds within syllables, what we call segmental phonological awareness, and to distinguish between different tones, which is suprasegmental sensitivity. So even though the character itself isn't based on sound, the way Chinese is typically taught involves a strong auditory component through these phonetic guide systems.
So even though you're not sounding out characters letter by letter, you're still engaging with the sounds of the language through pinyin or suan fu hao. That's really interesting. What about the visual spatial skills? How does learning Chinese seem to affect those?
The article proposes that the intense visual demands of learning and remembering all those characters, along with a focus on really precise visual motor practice through copying, paying close attention to the order of the strokes, and fitting those characters neatly inside imaginary boxes. All of that might contribute to the development of stronger visual spatial abilities. And there's research to support this. Studies have actually found a link between a child's ability to copy unfamiliar symbols or even just simple line drawings accurately and how well they can read in Chinese. And this link holds true even when researchers take into account their phonological processing skills. It's like this additional layer of cognitive development. Furthermore, studies comparing Chinese-speaking children and adults to those who primarily use alphabetic languages have often found that the Chinese speakers perform better on certain visual tasks. It's almost as if the act of learning to read and write Chinese is a workout for specific parts of the brain. The sheer amount of visual information you have to remember is huge, and the constant practice of copying, it seems to sharpen those visual spatial abilities, making them a fundamental part of acquiring literacy in Chinese. While the direct link between these visual skills and word recognition might be strongest in the early grades, the foundation that's laid is significant. The article even brings up this really intriguing idea that learning Chinese might lead to even more cognitive benefits beyond those usually associated with bilingualism, although more research is definitely needed in that area.
This deep dive into the world of Chinese literacy has been truly fascinating. Just to quickly recap, we've explored the special role that semantic radicals play as these little carriers of meaning, the critical importance of morphological awareness in understanding how characters are put together to form words, the fascinating implications of having two different scripts for the same language, and the potential for learning Chinese to enhance both phonological sensitivity through those phonetic systems like pinyin and visual spatial skills through the sheer demands of the writing system itself. It's pretty clear that we can't just take what we know about learning to read in alphabetic languages and apply it to the complexities of Chinese literacy.
I totally agree. Chinese offers this incredibly unique perspective on how we learn to read and the intricate ways that language, writing systems, and our cognitive abilities all interact.
And on that note, here's a final thought for you all to ponder. Given everything we've talked about these visual meaning codes embedded in radicals, the importance of combining those units of meaning, those two variations of the script, and the potential cognitive advantages, what do you think would be the most effective ways to learn Chinese, whether you're a native speaker just starting out or an adult learning it as a second language? How can understanding these fundamental differences inform the way we teach the language? And could it even offer new insights into cognitive development and how learning different types of writing systems actually shapes our brains? It's definitely something worth thinking about. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We'll see you next time.